Hello, good morning. Edgardo Sambo here once again, and this time we are now on episode number 27. And the topic for today would be about Elijah. And the question is, did God bring Elijah to heaven alive with flesh and blood? I'm sorry to answer you that this doctrine is not true. This doctrine is totally erroneous, false, and non-biblical. I am going to present the books, the chapter, and the verses without reading the verses for the purpose of condensing the contents, because due to time limitations, I have to shorten this topic. So, to prove that there are no people in heaven yet, or hell yet, let me give you these following books. In the book of John, chapter 5, verse 37, in the book of John, chapter 6, verse 46, in the book of Exodus, chapter 33, verse 20, in the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 6, verse 16, in the book of John, chapter 1, verse 18, in the book of 1 John, chapter 4, verse 12, in the book of John, chapter 3, verse 13, in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. These are the books which specified that no man had ever reached heaven except the Son of Man, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if it said that no man had reached heaven, Elijah and Enoch are men, so they could not reach heaven yet. They haven't gone to heaven yet, especially alive with flesh and bones. So, Elijah did not reach heaven alive with flesh and bones, based on the reason that you could find in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verses 27, that it is destined for man once to die. So Elijah is a man, and he was bound to die here on earth. And in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 50, flesh and blood cannot enter heaven, nor corrupted body cannot inherit incorrupted body. Elijah is flesh and blood, therefore he cannot enter heaven. And in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 40, it says that all people who had died will be glorified together. And glorification had not happened yet, because glorification will only happen during the second coming of Christ. And as you know, Christ had not returned for the second time yet. Therefore, the body of Enoch and Elijah had not been glorified yet. To enter heaven, your body has to resurrect, it has to be glorified, it has to be transformed into an immortal body, and to be a non-perishable body. And this would only happen during the second coming of Christ, which had never happened yet. Therefore, Elijah had not resurrected yet. Elijah died here on earth. His body had not resurrected yet. His body had not been transformed into an immortal body yet. And his body had not been converted into a non-corruptible body yet. Therefore, it is tantamount to saying that Elijah is not qualified to enter heaven, because the second coming of Christ had not happened yet. In the book of Hebrews 11:32, it says there that all prophets during the olden times had died, and Elijah was a prophet. Therefore, he died here on earth. And it says that Elijah had been brought to heaven by a chariot of fire with horses of fire. It says there Elijah had been brought to heaven, but it did not specify what heaven was Elijah brought to. Because for your information, there are three heavens: the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven. The third heaven is being proved in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 2 to 4, in which Apostle Paul, by his Spirit, was brought to the third heaven. And the Bible says that Elijah was brought to heaven. It did not specify if it was the third heaven. Therefore, it is conclusive that Elijah was brought to the first heaven, not even the second heaven. Because if Elijah was brought to the second heaven, his body could not sustain the stress and the force in the second heaven, and especially there is no oxygen in the second heaven. So definitely Elijah was only brought to the first heaven, and after that he was brought back to earth. Because of these reasons, it is very clear that Elijah was not brought to heaven alive with flesh and blood, because Elijah was a man bound to die. Elijah was flesh and blood with corruptible body, and he was not qualified to enter heaven. And Elijah was a prophet, and all prophets died in the Old Testament. And Elijah was not brought to the third heaven. It only said he was brought to heaven. And definitely he was not brought to the second or third heaven. So it is conclusive that he was brought only to the first heaven, and after that he was returned to earth. In the book of John chapter 3 verse 13, only the Son of Man had been to heaven, and the Son of Man was Jesus Christ. It is very specific. It said on that verse that only the Son of Man had reached to heaven. The word is only. That means there is no other human being that had reached heaven except Jesus Christ. And Enoch and Elijah were men, so they were not able to reach heaven because only Jesus Christ had gone to heaven. Now let me give you the details why Elijah did not reach heaven alive. In the book of John, chapter 3, verse 13, as what I have said, only Jesus Christ had reached heaven. Therefore, Elijah did not reach heaven. In the book of 1 Corinthians, verse 15, in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 22, after Adam, all men had died. That is very clear. After Adam was born and he died, all his siblings and siblings after siblings, they had died. That means to say, Elijah had also died because he was part of the family of Adam and Eve. In the book of 1 Kings, chapter 18, verses 7 to 8, the king of Israel, which is King Ahab, had ordered his servant Obadiah to look for Elijah, because during those times Elijah had the habit of disappearing. And King Ahab of Israel had ordered Obadiah to look for Elijah, and when Obadiah had found Elijah, Elijah told him, "Go back to King Ahab and tell King Ahab that you had found me." In this time frame, Elijah was still on earth. In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 2, verse 11, it says here that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire and with horses of fire. Please take note that in this time frame, it says here that Elijah was brought to heaven. It only said brought to heaven. Please take note that there are three heavens: the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven. The third heaven is where God the Father is residing. It did not state that Elijah was brought to the third heaven. It only stated that Elijah was brought to heaven. It could be the first heaven and the second heaven. And definitely Elijah could not be brought to the second heaven, because in the second heaven there is no oxygen there, and Elijah would die when he reached the second heaven. So definitely, in my opinion and in my conclusion, that Elijah was only brought to the first heaven. And from the first heaven, he was brought back to earth. And on the earth, Elijah died, because Elijah was a prophet, and as a prophet and as a man, Elijah was supposed to die here on earth. So take note that on this book, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, Elijah was taken to heaven, and definitely he was only taken to the first heaven and brought back to earth to die here on earth. And in the book of 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 11, it says here that, what do you call this? In this book it says here that King Joram or Jehoram of Israel asked the help of King Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom, to help fight against the king of Moab. In this time frame, the king of Israel is now King Jehoram, which was the son of King Ahab of Israel. When King Jehoram became the king of Israel, the king of Edom was trying to attack Israel. So King Jehoram of Israel had asked the help of King Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom. Now please take note that in this time frame, Elijah was already missing. And it was claimed that Elijah was already taken to heaven. Now in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 12, in this time frame, King Jehoshaphat had already died. And Jehoram, his son, took over the throne. Please take note that there are two Jehorams mentioned in this topic. The first Jehoram was King Jehoram, the son of King Ahab of Israel. And this King Jehoram had inherited the throne as king of Israel. And in this time frame, this was the time frame that Elijah had disappeared. But in this book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 12, in this time frame, King Jehoshaphat of Judah had already died, and his son Jehoram had become the king of Judah. Please take note, this Jehoram is not Jehoram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel. This Jehoram is the son of King Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. When King Jehoshaphat had died, Jehoram had taken over the throne, and he became the king of Judah. Incidentally, this King Jehoram was very cruel to his constituents. He even killed his parents, his brothers and sisters. And because of this cruelty, Elijah sent King Jehoram a letter telling him that God was condemning his cruelty to his constituents. Now the question is, if Elijah had gone to heaven on the time frame of King Jehoram, the son of King Ahab of Israel, because that was the time which they claimed that Elijah was brought to heaven in a chariot of fire. That time frame was under the leadership of King Jehoram, the son of King Ahab of Israel. While Elijah has sent his letter to King Jehoram, the son of King Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, which means that when Elijah had sent the letter to King Jehoram of the king of Judah, it was stated that he was already taken to heaven. So if Elijah was already taken to heaven, and he sent King Jehoram of Judah a letter condemning his cruelty to his constituents, then how can Elijah send this letter to King Jehoram of Judah when Elijah was in heaven? It would be impossible. It would be not logical that Elijah was in heaven, then he will go back to earth to send the letter to King Jehoram of Judah, and after sending his letter to King Jehoram of Judah, he is going back to heaven. That will not be impossible. So definitely, when Elijah was taken to heaven, he was only taken to the first heaven. And what is the first heaven? The first heaven is the expanse of space on the earth to the clouds. That is the first heaven, as mentioned in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 1 up to 4. That firmament was called the first heaven. The first heaven is the space on top of the earth until to the clouds where you could find the rain. That was the first heaven. And the second heaven naturally is after the first heaven, in which you could not find oxygen there. And Elijah could not be brought to the second heaven because of the lack of oxygen. And definitely Elijah could not be brought to the third heaven because only Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, had been brought to heaven, except of course the angels, of course. The angels had been brought to heaven. But we are talking about human beings here, and Elijah is a human being. So definitely, Elijah was not brought to the second heaven. Elijah was not brought to the third heaven. But definitely, Elijah was only brought to the first heaven, which is just above the earth, not going beyond the clouds. And definitely, Elijah was brought back to earth to die here on earth as a prophet, because as a man, he was bound to die here on earth. So definitely, Elijah had died here on earth. Some viewers of this video and some viewers or readers of this tract will comment that Elijah had written the letter before he was brought back, or before he was brought to heaven. Let me present to you the sequence of events before Elijah sent his letter to King Jehoram of Judah. In the book of 1 Kings, chapter 18, verses 11 to 12, this was the time frame when King Ahab of Israel ordered Obadiah to look for Elijah. In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 2, verse 11, this was the time frame when King Ahab of Israel had died, and his son Ahaziah took over the throne. But the problem is, his son Ahaziah do not have an inheritor, do not have a son. So when King Ahaziah died, it was his brother Jehoram that took over the throne, because King Ahab of Israel had two sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram. So when Ahaziah had died with no inheritor, it was Jehoram who took over the throne of Israel. Now, in this time frame, when King Jehoram became the king of Israel, it was in this time frame that Elijah was taken to heaven. So take note that Elijah was taken to heaven on the time frame that King Jehoram, the brother of Ahaziah, the other son of King Ahab of Israel, had taken over the throne. By that time, Jehoram the king, Jehoram the son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, had not taken over the throne of Judah yet, because King Jehoshaphat was still alive. So, King Jehoram took over the throne of Israel when Ahaziah died, and in this time frame, it was during this time that Elijah was taken to heaven. And in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 12, in this time frame, So as what I've said in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 12, it was in this time frame that King Jehoshaphat of Judah had died, and his son Jehoram took over the throne. So take note, there were two Jehorams. The first Jehoram was the king of Israel, who took over the throne of King Ahab of Israel. And the second Jehoram was the son of King Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. When King Jehoshaphat had died, King Jehoram had taken over the throne of Judah. And in this time frame, this was the time when Elijah had sent a letter to King Jehoram of Judah, condemning King Jehoram of too much cruelty. I would like to emphasize that this time frame when Elijah sent the letter to King Jehoram of Judah, this was after the time frame of King Jehoram of Israel. Take note that it was stated in the Bible that Elijah was taken to heaven in the time frame of King Jehoram of Israel. That was on that time frame. Now, King Jehoram, who took over the throne of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, was after the time frame of King Jehoram of Israel. Therefore, when Elijah had sent the letter to King Jehoram of Judah, it was concluded that Elijah had already been brought to heaven alive with flesh and blood. And the question is, how can Elijah send this letter to King Jehoram of Judah if Elijah was in heaven? That would be illogical. That would be impossible. Would it be that Elijah in heaven would go back to earth, send the letter to King Jehoram of Judah, and after sending the letter to King Jehoram of Judah, Elijah would go back to heaven alive with flesh and bones? That would be very illogical, very erroneous, and very non-biblical. It only means that Elijah was not brought to the second heaven. Elijah was not brought to the third heaven where God the Father resides, and Elijah was not able to see God face to face because his body was corrupt. His body was corruptible. He was in his flesh and blood composition. Please take note, my fellow Bible-believing Christians, that when Jesus Christ said in John 5, verse 37, Jesus Christ said that you have never seen God, nor heard His voice. To see God, first you have to die here on earth. Secondly, your body has to be resurrected, to be glorified, to be immortal, to be non-perishable. That means to say, this incident will only happen during the second coming of Christ. And the second coming of Christ have not happened yet. The second coming of Christ will happen in the future, while Enoch and Elijah had died in the past, in the Old Testament. So in that Old Testament, in those olden times, no human beings had resurrected yet. No human beings had been glorified yet. No human beings had been made immortal and non-perishable yet, because the second coming of Christ have not happened yet. So how can Elijah and Enoch be brought to heaven when their bodies are still buried in the grave? Because their bodies have not resurrected yet. Their bodies have not been turned immortal yet, and non-perishable yet, and glorified yet, because the second coming of Christ have not happened yet. That is impossible in the flesh and blood composition of the bodies of Enoch and Elijah. They could not be brought to heaven in that flesh and blood composition. It is very impossible. God the Father will not change His laws. Excuse me. Sorry about that. God the Father had made His laws, and He said that no human beings with the blood and flesh composition, no human beings could enter heaven. Will God the Father change His laws just to satisfy Enoch and Elijah? I don't think so. When God the Father made His laws, these laws will stick, and these laws will not change unless, of course, the Son of God, which was Jesus Christ, would change these laws. Please take note of that. So if pastors, ministers, and evangelists would tell their members that Enoch and Elijah had gone to heaven with flesh and blood composition, with a corruptible body, those teachers of these doctrines are teaching false doctrines. Could you claim that Jesus Christ had lied when he said in John 5 verse 37 that you have not seen God nor heard his voice? That means you, all people on the earth, have not seen God or heard the voice of God. Why would be Enoch and Elijah be an exemption to what Jesus Christ has said? Do you mean to say that Jesus Christ was a liar? That is blasphemy. I could never accept that kind of doctrine. The doctrines that I am teaching are coming from the Bible, not from my opinions. It is coming directly from the Bible. And Christ had said, no human beings had seen God, and no human beings had heard the voice of God, and that includes Enoch and Elijah. And the teaching of flesh and blood cannot enter heaven is the teaching of Jesus Christ. If you said that Enoch and Elijah had gone to heaven, had been brought to heaven with flesh and blood, then you are accusing Christ of lying. Isn't it? Jesus Christ could never commit a sin. Jesus Christ is a sinless human being. So when Jesus Christ said, no flesh and blood human being could enter heaven, that is definitely a big no, a big no. Never twist the words in the Bible. Never teach that Enoch and Elijah had been brought to heaven alive with the flesh and blood composition, because that is totally false. For my fellow Bible-believing Christians, please don't be misled with this kind of teachings. No man, that means no man is no man, had gone to heaven yet, except Jesus Christ, the Son of Man. I am talking about common men. Jesus Christ is not a common man. My fellow Bible-believing Christians, please study your Bible consistently and understand your Bible. I am doing my broadcasting every 2 weeks. And on my next broadcast, episode number 28, I will be discussing the case of Moses and the reasons why there are no human beings in heaven or hell yet, and the reason why Moses had not seen God yet, nor heard his voice in Mount Sinai. So in the meantime, I would say bye-bye. And if you would like to see my other broadcasts, just go to YouTube, and in the word search, type my name, Edgardo Sambo, and all episodes, episode number 1 to episode number 27, would be shown to you by YouTube. In the meantime, bye-bye, and see you after 2 weeks.